My name is John LeVar, and I'm a volunteer out of Pomp Pillar, which is run by the Bureau of Land Management. And I've been a volunteer out there since the year 2000. And I like to tell stories about Lewis and Clark. And today I'm going to tell you a story about baby Pomp, whatever happened to baby Pomp. The life of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Baby Pomp was the son of Toussaint Charbonneau in Sacagawea. And this is a photograph or a painting by Michael Haynes. It's a modern painting of what he may have looked like when he was at the pillar, because he was only 17 months old when he was at the pillar. And that's what the pillar looked like in 1873. It's the first photograph we have of the pillar. And if you notice, there aren't any trees along in here. And today, that's all filled with trees. So it looked a little different when he was here. This is probably much closer to what it looked like than what it looks like today. This is Clark's map. Notice he says it's Pompey's Tower. And here's the pillar channel that goes around the base of the rock. And here's the river heading east. This is another photograph that was taken in 1873. And again, you can see part of that channel that's running right through here and out, and there's no trees there, so it looked a little different. But baby Pomp was, and that's the signature that you get up about halfway up the rock, and you see this signature that Clark carved in the rock, and then he named the rock after the baby, after the baby's nickname. Now, Pomp was born on February 11th, 1805, and I want you to remember this date because it's going to come up again in just a moment. He was born at in the Fort Mandan, and I would like to read what Lewis wrote in his journal at the time of the baby's birth. Let's see. He said, about 5 o'clock this evening, one of the wives of Charbonneau, Sacagawea, was delivered of a fine boy. It is worthy of remark that this was the first child which this woman had borne, and as is common in such cases, her labor was tedious and the pain violent. Mr. Jessam, who was a fur trader with the Northwest Company, informed me that he had frequently administered a small portion of the rattlesnake, which he assured me had never failed to produce the desired effect, that of hastening the birth of the child. Having the rattle of a snake by me, I gave it to him, and he administered 2 rings of it to the woman, broken in small pieces with the fingers, and added to a small quantity of water. Whether this medicine was truly the cause or not, I shall not undertake to determine, but I was informed that she had not taken it more than 10 minutes before she brought forth. Perhaps this remedy may be worthy of future experiments, but I must confess that I want faith as to its efficacy. Now, it's interesting because the stuff that a rattlesnake rattle is made out of is the same things your fingernails are made out of. So, ladies, if you just want to chew your fingernails, you'll get the same effect. And as one woman said, "Mister, we already do that." This is what Fort Mandan may have looked like. This is a artist rendition, and if you'll notice, this is the fort back here, kind of a squared off fort. This is the keel boat that they came up the river on. Here are the 2 pirogues, and this is what this artist thought that looked like. Well, today it looks like this. This is not built on the exact same site. In fact, it's a ways from it, but it is a replica that most historians agree is close to what the fort looked like. This is the inside of the fort. So baby Pomp would have been born in one of these cubicles in the fort, a pretty primitive beginning. Carl Bodmer was an artist that came out in the 1830s, and he painted scenes from the upper Missouri, and this is a Mandan village. This is what the Mandan villages looked like, probably when Lewis and Clark were there. You see the women here in bull boats crossing the Missouri River. And on April 7th, on 1805, they said, we set out on our voyage up the river in 2 pirogues and 6 canoes. Our party consisted of, and then he lists the whole crew, Charbonneau and his Indian squaw to act as an interpreter and interpretress for the Snake Indians and Charbonneau's infant. And then he writes Sacagawea, and this is about the first place where her name is written in the journals. And notice he's underlined it so we know that it refers to Charbonneau's wife. Now, I want you to take a look at the date, April 7th. Remember, the date when Pomp was born was February 11th. So we have February, March, April, 2 months. So we have a 2-month-old baby. She was probably about 17, we're not sure. But we have a 17-year-old girl with a 2-month-old infant and 31 men going upriver. And she's not going to see another woman until August. So she's in charge of this child, and if something happens to her, the child will die because the men can't take care of it. Now here's a map of the outgoing trip so you know a little bit about where we are. The Mandan villages are over here, and they're going to travel on the Missouri River. They're going to get up into here, right into this area is Great Falls. And at Great Falls they have a portage, and it takes them a whole month to portage around the Great Falls. And then they come follow the Missouri and its tributaries to here. They get a guide. This is where they meet the Shoshone. And then they come up here and across, meet the Nez Perce here. They come on out and make a fort here. And we're going to stop at a couple places along the way and tell some of the stories of what they did and saw. This is Charlie Fritz, a Billings artist who has portrayed himself as the artist with Lewis and Clark. And this is Lewis at the Great Falls. And these have all been modified with dams and what have you, but this is what we think they may have looked like when they were there. And they portaged around there. It took them a whole month to get around the falls. And while they were there, Clark went hunting with the Charbonneau family. And while they were out hunting, it started to rain. And they started to look for shelter. Well, there aren't any trees up there, so they got down in a gully under a rock overhang. Must have been a pretty good sized rock overhang. They got under there to stay dry. And Sacagawea probably took her baby out of the cradle board, and you'll find out why we know that in a moment. And Clark noticed that the gully was filling up with water much faster than he expected. And quite frankly, they were in the middle of a Montana flash flood. And Clark realized there was a danger, and there's only one thing to do in a flash flood, and that's to run to higher ground. You got to get up, away from the water. And Toussaint Charbonneau got out of the gully first, and he's reaching down to grab his wife to pull her out. She's got the baby in one arm, reaching up to get pulled out, and Clark is pushing her from behind. And Clark said that before he got out of there, the water was thigh deep. If they had been washed out, they would have gone into the Missouri River above the falls, and they would most likely have been killed. Now, the next day they made a list of the things that were lost in the flood. And it's kind of interesting because it changes my whole image of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the way they behaved on the expedition. You see, because William Clark lost his umbrella, and we never think of Clark walking along the prairie carrying an umbrella. But then in August they meet the Shoshone, and this is Sacagawea's home tribe, and she meets her brother Kamehameha, and they trade for horses, and she's instrumental in getting them horses for the trip over the mountains. And then they get out to the west coast to Fort Clatsop. Again, we don't know where this fort really was. They've never found good archaeological evidence, but there's pretty much agreement that this is the way the fort looked. It's a different design than Fort Mandan. And notice that they named the forts after the Indian tribes that are camped nearby. So this is Fort Clatsop. And this is John Clymer's rendition of some Clatsop Indians coming with fish to trade at the fort. And if you notice, Sacagawea looks very, very different from the local Indians. And she looks as different from the Indians as these guys do. So there's quite a cultural difference. And you notice that in Clymer's picture here, he's got water in the fort. It rained all the time they were there. It was very uncomfortable. And the Clatsop Indians didn't wear buckskin because the buckskin rotted in the bad weather. So that's one of the reasons for the difference in clothing. While they were there, Clark got word that there was a whale that had been washed up on the, from the ocean, and he wanted to try to get some whale blubber, so he planned to travel to the coast to see the whale. And their camp was about 30 miles from the coast. And Sacagawea said she hadn't seen the big water yet. She wanted to go see the big water. This happens to be one of my favorite paintings of the Lewis and Clark trip. It's entitled Sacagawea at the Big Water. And notice that she's got the cradle board on here, and baby Pomp is in the cradle board. Of course, there are no babysitters. Everywhere she went, the baby went. Then they come back, on the trip back, they come back to the Nez Perce here, pick up their horses, travel over, get here to Traveler's Rest, and Lewis goes this way to Great Falls, and Clark goes down this way, and then eventually to the Yellowstone River. And then they meet up out here. Oh, and by the way, this little bump right here, that's very significant. Billings is right here, Pompey's Pillar is right there. So on his original map, we can pick out exactly where we are. As they're coming down the Yellowstone, they see thousands and thousands of big game animals. And then when they were at the Billings area, they commented, Clark writes in his journals about the number of animals that he saw, and he says, I'm going to stop writing about this because nobody's going to believe me that there are this many animals here. And the next day, he's at Pompey's Pillar, and again, he's talking about how many animals he's seen. This particular incident occurred near Glendive, Montana. There was a herd of buffalo crossing the river, and they had to stop. They were worried about the buffalo getting into their canoes and damaging their canoes. And you notice here's York with a rifle, ready to fire if he has to. Clark's got his rifle. This fellow's got a buffalo robe, trying to wave the buffalo away so they don't get to the canoe and damage the canoe. So we called this part of the Yellowstone the Serengeti of North America because of all the big game animals that were here. They get to the Mandan villages, and Lewis and Clark are now back together, and they drop off the Charbonneau family here. And this is a painting by George Catlin. He was an artist that was out here in the 1830s, and this is what the Mandan village looked like, or one of the Mandan villages looked like. I like to show this because not all the Plains Indians lived in teepees. Notice that there's a stockade that they built around the village to keep their enemies out, probably the Sioux Indians. Notice they're sturdy enough that the people can get up on top of these buildings, and they're strong enough to hold them. If we go inside the buildings, this is Carl Bodmer. He was another artist that was out here in the 1830s. Notice that there's 2 or 4 big columns that they sunk in the ground. They put cross beams across here, and then they laid the logs in against it, and they covered it all with dirt. And you can see that this is big enough to bring horses inside, have the dogs inside, and I'm sure that in the wintertime it was important to try to keep warm. Now, when they left the Mandan villages, Clark wrote a letter back to Charbonneau, and I've extracted a few things from the letter that I think are significant. You have been a long time with me and have conducted yourself in such a manner as to gain my friendship. As to your little son, my boy Pomp, you well know my fondness for him and my anxiety to take and raise him as my own child. Wishing you and your family great success, and with anxious expectations of seeing my little dancing boy Baptiste, I shall remain your friend, William Clark, August 20th, 1806. There's a couple things with this letter that I think are quite significant. First, the obvious one is that he wanted to adopt Pomp. He wanted to take him back to St. Louis with him and adopt him. The other thing that I think is quite significant with this is his attitude toward Toussaint Charbonneau. We all know that Meriwether Lewis did not like Charbonneau. There's quite a bit of evidence that he didn't have much use for Charbonneau at all. But here we see that Clark did indeed respect Charbonneau, and as a matter of fact, Clark continued to employ Charbonneau into the 1830s as an interpreter, as an official interpreter for the federal government. So there was a much better relationship between Clark and Charbonneau than there was between Lewis and Charbonneau. In 1809, Toussaint brings his family to St. Louis, and on December 28th, he had him baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. And then Jean-Baptiste attended school there, and in 1813 he learns of his mother's death. Now the school that he attended, one time he was being instructed by a Baptist minister, and another time he was instructed by Jesuits, and those Jesuits are the ones who founded the University of St. Louis. So he may be called an alumnus of the University of St. Louis. I don't know if that's fair or not, but that's... Now, his mother died in 1813 or 1812, and he found out about it in 1814 here at Fort Manuel. It's on the Missouri River between North and South Dakota. Now, there's another story that she's buried, she lived into her 80s and is buried here on the Wind River Reservation. And I'm not going to go into that unless you want me to as an audience, the difference of those two places, but most modern historians think she was buried up there. Now, John Luddig wrote in his journals, "This evening the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of putrid fever. She was a good and the best woman in the fort, aged about 25 years. She left a fine infant girl." And that's the thing that we think that was Sacagawea. He doesn't mention her name. The only place her name is ever mentioned anywhere is in the journals. Other than that, she's just Charbonneau's wife, and since we know that Charbonneau had several wives, is she the right wife? Is the big question. And, but Luddig had sent Charbonneau to deal with the Crow Indians, and he hadn't returned. He didn't return until even in the springtime. And Luddig thought that Charbonneau was dead. So he took Lisette, the baby girl, to St. Louis and effectively adopted her. This is the adoption record. I got this off the internet, it's pretty blurry, but this is the adoption record. And you can see here, this was John Luddig's name here, and it's crossed out, and William Clark's name is written above it. So Clark at that point assumed guardianship of the two children. This is what that adoption certificate says. It's not particularly important, but one of the confusing issues here is that one of the infant children of Charbonneau, to wit Toussaint Charbonneau, a boy about the age of 10 years old. Well, people read that and said, oh, it's a different boy. It's not Jean-Baptiste, it's another boy that he named after himself. And it wasn't until more modern times that we realized that in the Catholic orphan system, if they knew the name of the father, they would name the son after the father to keep track of who he belonged to. And so it's thought now that this Toussaint Charbonneau is indeed Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and but the Catholic Church had just changed his name for the purposes of this adoption. Toussaint Charbonneau was not dead. He joined up with his son later on, and there's more to be said then about that later. Now this is a map of St. Louis at that time. You can see it was a rather small community, and so he probably knew everybody in the community, or a lot of people in the community. And it's interesting that Jim Bridger was about the same age as as Jean-Baptiste, and was there as an apprentice. Come on, hammer and anvil, blacksmith. There we go. Then when he was 17 years old, He's at the mouth of the Kansas River, right out here. And his dad is up here, in these places up here. And there's a fellow by the name of Duke Paul Wilhelm from Württemberg, Germany, who was a naturalist, and he came up to St. Louis, met with Clark, and Clark, because everybody that came out into the Indian Territory had to have approval from William Clark, a very important person, Clark recommended that he meet to St. Charbonneau up here and to learn more about the Great Plains. But on the way up, he met Jean-Baptiste by the Kansas River. This is Duke Paul Wilhelm. This is a portrait of him several years later. And this is a sketch that may or may not be a sketch of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. The Duke made this sketch at the mouth of the Kansas River, where the boy was located. It's a young man, probably of Indian birth, and he's got a little mustache and long hair. And the story of this sketch in itself is very interesting. In the 1930s, a historian was in Germany and saw this sketch, realized what it might be, but he took a photograph of it and brought it back with a photograph back to the United States. And during World War II, the library that this sketch was in was bombed and destroyed. So we have this picture of the sketch, but we don't have the sketch itself. Okay, on November 6th, the Duke and Baptiste were sailing back down the Mississippi, and they were in a boat called the Cincinnati. This is not the Cincinnati, it's called the Great Republic, but it's probably similar to the Cincinnati, and the boat sunk. Now what happens in the Mississippi at that time, coming down from the Missouri, there would be a lot of cottonwood trees that would get ripped out of the bank, and it would be brought down with the floodwaters, and the big ball of the root ball would go into the bottom of the river, and the tree itself would be floating, and the current would drag the top of the tree down, and then it would come back up. And the current would drag it down, and then the current would bring it back up. It's called a sawyer, because that's the way the sawing motion if guys were sawing wood. It was called a sawyer. And when it was down this way, the ship's captain couldn't see it. Didn't know it was there. And when it came up, then it was very dangerous. And if it came up underneath the boat, as the boat was going over it, it would rip a hole in the bottom of the boat. And that's what happened to the Cincinnati, and it sank, and they had to go back to St. Louis and wait for another boat to take them down. And the Duke took Jean-Baptiste to Germany for 5 years. He was in Germany for 5 years. This is the Duke's castle. It's probably one of the biggest buildings, bigger than anything he saw in the United States, except maybe in New Orleans. They lived up in this area of the castle, and I got to thinking about how can we compare what life was like in Germany with life on the frontier. And I decided to try to use music. So I'm going to attempt to show you that here. This is going to be God Willing, the Creek Don't Rise. Come on, baby, you can do it. I usually open this before I do this show, so it's already open and ready to go.
That's okay.
By the way, this music is, the fellow that put this music together did a lot of research as what instruments they had available to them while they were on the trip and what music they may have been able to play. And this is the music that comes out. called La Vastrigue, French. But when he's in Germany, this is what he would have been listening to. And let's just go here. It just so happens Beethoven died while Jean-Baptiste was in Europe.
Really?
So he very well could have heard this music, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, while he was in Germany. So you can see the cultural span that this young man was straddling when he was in Europe. No, it doesn't want to move. Now it's going to jump 2, I'll bet. No. This I originally designed to go along with the music. Yeah, it did jump 2, didn't it? Okay. These are voyageurs. There's an elder man and a young man. These are beaver pelts. And there's a cat. When I first saw this painting, I thought, yeah, right, they had cats. They had cats. And then when I started studying the fur trade, I found out that cats were as valuable as mules, and mules were worth 3 horses. So a cat was very valuable. And he said, well, why was a cat valuable to the fur trade? Well, a cat eats mice, and the mice eat the fur pelts. So they're very valuable to the fur trade. Very valuable indeed. And of course, this is a portrait of Ludwig van Beethoven, and for those of you who don't know, he was deaf when he wrote that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I can't imagine doing that. This was St. Louis in 1840, which was a ways after he came back, but you see that St. Louis was really a growing metropolis at the time. When Baptiste came back, he came up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, and there he needs a job. And he's hired by the American Fur Company. And he knew some important people. His father, when he was baptized, had asked Auguste Chouteau, or Chouteau, however you want to pronounce it, to be his godfather. And this is a member of the Chouteau family, and it's his relatives that started the city of St. Louis. So old Toussaint Charbonneau knew some real important people and used that. And of course he also knew William Clark, who at that time was the superintendent of Indian Affairs. And these men were involved in the fur trade. And Auguste Chouteau was one of the owners of the American Fur Company, and got him a job with the American Fur Company. Now the expedition that he was on traveled from St. Louis up the Missouri to the Platte River, up the Platte River, and went over South Pass and into Idaho. This is the route that became the Oregon Trail, so it was a pretty important route. And the reason we know that he was up here in Idaho is he got lost up here. Have any of you ever been to Craters of the Moon National Park in Idaho? It's all black lava stone, very sharp, very rugged, very ugly place actually. And he got lost there. And he was gone for 10 days. And they thought he was dead because no one could survive out there. But when he got back with the group, they knew that he was a true mountain man, not just a pork eater. With the rendezvous, with the fur trade, we have something called a rendezvous. And rendezvous is a French word that means let's get together. And the people that got together were the businessmen from St. Louis, bringing trade goods out to the fur trade, and of course the Indians and the mountain men with their furs to trade the furs for the next year's trade goods that they would need, and other supplies. And you can imagine that when these guys got together, they were pretty much alone out on the prairie, maybe 50 to 100 people in a group, and that was a big group. Other than that, they were smaller groups, and they had a big party and had a lot of fun. Well, as guys get together, a lot of times it turns kind of ugly. And this one time, some horse equipment was stolen, and Jean-Baptiste accused a white man of stealing that stuff, and the white man said, "I'll have you horsewhipped for that." Jean-Baptiste didn't like the sound of that, so he took out his knife and stabbed the guy in the shoulder and ended the discussion. So he was capable of protecting himself and taking care of himself. Another time he was around a campfire. I'm sure there was alcohol involved, and two of his friends got into a fight. He wanted to make sure it was a fair fight, so he picked up a bullwhip. And if anybody tried to get in on that fight, you know how everybody wants to get in on a fight. Everybody wants to get in. They get in, he'd pop him with that bullwhip. Pop him with the bullwhip. And he said, until the big guy jumped on the little guy's back, and the little guy drew a pistol and shot the big guy in the thigh. But it was a fair fight. Because Jean-Baptiste was there, and with his bullwhip. Then later, the late 1830s, early 1840s, when the fur trade is drying up, he travels south of the Front Range in Colorado, and he was ferrying hides down the Platte River. Now the Platte River is French, or excuse me, Spanish. Platte means Spanish for flat, and it's said about the Platte River that it's 1 inch deep and 1 mile wide, and it's also said that it's too thick to drink and too thin to plow. So he was on that river. The first time he tried it, he made it all the way to St. Louis because he got the floodwaters in the spring right, so he was okay. But the second time he tried it, he started off a little bit late and got stuck on an island. And people would stop by. As I said, this is the Platte Rivers where the Oregon Trail eventually wound up. And people would stop by and they'd go over on the island, have supper with this fellow, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and they said he had a good sense of humor, he was well-read in the issues of the day, and that he could make a good mint julep. But he called the island St. Helena, and this gives us an insight into his sense of humor, because you see, the Emperor Napoleon had been exiled to St. Helena, and Jean-Baptiste felt he was on exile in this island in the Platte River with all the mosquitoes and everything, just as Napoleon was exiled. Gives you some insight into him. A few years later, in the 1840s, he goes down to southeastern Colorado to Bent's Fort. This is what Bent's Fort looks like today. It was a very important fur trade fort. And at that time, in 1846, we have two major events happening. It's the Mexican-American War, and this is when the Mormon head to Salt Lake. And the Mormon volunteered some of their young men to join the military and head out to California, figuring it was a cheap way to get their young men west, and they formed what's called the Mormon Battalion. And this is the route of the Mormon Battalion from Iowa, Council Bluffs, all the way down here and all the way out to the San Luis Rey Mission. Bent's Fort is right up here. When they got to Bent's Fort, they reformed their group, and they hired Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau as a guide for the Mormon Battalion, and he guided them on out to the San Luis Rey Mission. A couple good stories that happened on that journey. One, he was hunting bear, and of course this was not for sport, this is for food. And he followed the bear over a hill, and then the colonel saw 2 more bears coming in around from the side. And so there's 3 bears and 1 guy, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. They said they heard a gunshot. 15 seconds later they heard another gunshot. For those of you who know anything about loading a muzzle loader, that's a pretty good load. And then there's silence. And they figured Jean-Baptiste was dead. And just then he came back over the top of the hill and hollered down in Spanish that he wanted some more ball of powder. But the story I really like is when he's out in front of the column riding a mule. And the mule came up lame. He's looking for the next day's camp. That's what he's doing. And the mule came up lame. He got off the mule to give it a break. And when he went to get back on the mule kicked him and walked away from him. And so he approached the mule again, and the mule walked away from him. and he approached the mule again, and the mule walked away from him. Followed the mule for 2 miles. So he shot the mule and got his gear off the mule and hiked back to the camp. Now he said he shot the mule because he didn't want the Apache to get his gear. But I think he shot the mule because the mule was being a mule. He gets out to the San Luis Rey Mission. That's what it looks like today. And this was a time in history when the San Luis Rey Mission was not owned by the Catholic Church. A little bit of that story. The Catholic Church founded the missions. When Mexico gained their independence, they took the missions back from the Catholic Church and they sold them to the rancheros. Rancheros were still using the Indians as workers. And if you know what a company town is, that's where the workers are not making enough money to buy survival items. They can't live on what they're making. So they're always in debt to the company town. And of course you've heard Tennessee Ernie's song about the company town. And I owe my soul to the company store. And that's what was going on here at the San Luis Rey Mission. Same thing. And Jean-Baptiste was hired as the alcalde of the San Luis Rey Mission. So he was kind of like the mayor, go-between, between the rancheros and the Indians. And he didn't like what he was seeing, and he started fighting in favor of the Indians. And the rancheros didn't like it. And when the Indians rebelled, he was accused of starting the rebellion. And there was a trial, and he proved that he was innocent, but he quit his job. He said he didn't want to be accused of helping Indians too much. Of course, after all, he's half Indian. And the year he quit, oh, by the way, this is his handwriting. This is where we have an example of his handwriting. It's at the San Luis Rey Mission. And if you're interested in what that thing says, that's it. It's just a legal thing. It's not really that interesting to our story, just that's the kind of work he was doing. But the year he quit was 1848. And what happened in California in 1848?
Gold rush.
They found gold. And he's down there. He doesn't need to cross the continent. He's down here. All he needs to do is go up here, and he's in the gold rush. And that's exactly what he did. And he paired up with a black mountain man by the name of Jim Beckworth. Jim Beckworth was a black mountain man. He was quite an enterprising man. And he wrote in his journals that he said, I paired up with my old buddy Charbonneau, and we panned for gold on Murderer's Bar in the American River. And this is a photograph that was taken of Beckworth later on. Now, he stayed in Placer County in California here until 1866. And at that time, there's a gold rush going on up here in Montana. And he decides to travel up to Montana. So as he's coming up here, he crosses over into this area of Oregon, Danner, Oregon, and he crosses the Owyhee River, and he caught a fever. And they took him to Inskip Station, which is it was made out of black lava stone, like this. They said it was impervious to bullets. This is the remains of that place. And there's really nothing there except a ranch is over here. And this tanker truck is part of the ranch. And you see this thing up here, that's an American flag. And that American flag is at the graveyard where he's buried. And that's yours truly. This site marks the final resting place of the youngest member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and so on. This is his tombstone. There's about 6 people buried there. This is the only one that has a tombstone. Notice what the Plains Indians do. To show their respect when they go to a gravesite, they will leave something personal at the gravesite as a sign of respect. And the Historic Society has very wisely left the stuff alone so that we can see what's there. And one of the things you see are cigarettes. And some people think that's disrespectful to leave cigarettes today because they're in a lot of bad press about cigarettes. But remember that tobacco is a sacred weed of the Indians. So when Indians leave a cigarette, they're leaving their sacred weed, their sacred grass there. And this is his tombstone. And this is Pompey's pillar. And at this point, I usually take questions if anybody wants. But I also, before I do that, I want to read his obituary. It's kind of long, but it's worth it. This appeared in the Placer Herald, July 7th, 1866. J.B. Charbonneau, death of a California pioneer. We are informed by Mr. Dana Perkins that he has received a letter announcing the death of J.B. Charbonneau, who left this country some weeks ago with 2 companions for Montana Territory. The letter is from one of the party who says Mr. C. was taken sick with mountain fever on the Owyhee and died after a short illness. Mr. Charbonneau was known to most of the pioneer citizens of this region of country, being himself one of the first adventurers into the territory now known as Placer County upon the discovery of gold, where he has remained with little intermission until his recent departure for the new gold field, Montana, which strangely enough was the land of his birth. Well, not quite, he was born in North Dakota, but it's close. Whither he was returning in the evening of life to spend the few remaining days that he felt was in store for him. Mr. Charbonneau was born in the western wilds and grew up a hunter, trapper, and pioneer among that class of men of which Jim Bridger and Beckworth and other noted trappers of the woods were the representatives. He was born in the country of the Crow Indians, no, the Mandan Hidatsa, his father being a Canadian Frenchman and his mother a half-breed of the Crow tribe. No, she was a full-blooded Shoshone. So what you're getting the idea here is you can't always trust a newspaper article. I think it's an important lesson to learn. He had, however, better opportunities than most of the rough spirits who followed the calling of trapper, as when a young man he went to Europe and spent several years where he learned to speak as well as write several languages. At the breaking out of the Mexican War, he was in the formation on the frontiers, and upon the organization of the Mormon Battalion, he was engaged as a guide and came with them to California. Subsequently, upon the discovery of gold, he, in company with Jim Beckworth, came upon the North Fork of the American River, and for a time it is said they were mining partners. Our acquaintance with Charbonneau dates back to '52, when we found him a resident of this county, where he has continued to reside almost continuously since, having given up frontier life. The reported discoveries of gold in Montana and the rapid peopling of the territory excited the imagination of the old trapper, and he determined to return to the scenes of his youth. Though strong of purpose, the weight of years was too much for the hardships of the trip undertaken, and he now sleeps alone by the bright waters of the Owyhee. Our information is very meager of the history of the deceased, a fact which we much regret, as he was of a class that for years lived among stirring and eventful scenes. The old man, on departing from Montana, gave us a call and said he was going to leave California, probably for good, as he was about returning to familiar scenes. We felt then as if we met him for the last time. Mr. Charbonneau was of pleasant manners, intelligent, well-read in the topics of the day, and was generally esteemed in the community in which he lived as a good, mean, and inoffensive man. That's a good obituary for anybody, for this Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. He could read, write, and speak English, French, German, Spanish. He knew how to speak Shoshone and Mandan, probably some other languages of the plains, and he knew the sign language of the plains. He'd been well educated for the times, going to school in St. Louis, and then he went to Europe in what we called the Grand Tour by rich white kids, and he went with German royalty. And he came back and went into the fur trade, and was in the fur trade a trapper, bringing rafts of goods down the Platte River to St. Louis, and a guide for the U.S. military, and on a call day at the San Luis Rey Mission, and in the gold rush. He was half Shoshone and half French, but I think he's all American, and that's who this pillar is named after, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Now, you got any questions? But there are people ask questions. Here's some of the stuff I have for answers to some of the other questions that they ask. They ask about the name of the pillar, and it was named by Clark, as you saw, Pompey's Tower. Nicholas Biddle was the first transcriber of the journals, and he just changed the name to Pompey's Pillar. Now, in all fairness to Biddle, there is nowhere in the journals that they mention the kid's name or nickname. Nowhere. It's always just the boy, the baby, or Charbonneau's son, or so on. So Biddle had no reason to understand that this would be named after him. And Biddle was aware that there was a newspaper article written in the National Intelligencer, which was the Washington Post of the day in Washington, D.C., about a discovery that Napoleon's archaeologists made in Egypt. They found a red granite column, and it was raised by the General Pomp and dedicated to the Emperor Diocletian. And I'm sure that Biddle just thought that Clark got it wrong, because Biddle corrected all the spelling, all the grammar, and all that sort of thing in the journals that he wrote. So he just corrected it to what he thought Clark meant. And then around 1900, there was another fellow by the name of Reuben Thwaites, who was the first direct transcriber of the journals, and he found the letter that we saw part of earlier in the show that Clark had sent back to Charbonneau, where he mentions the boy's name. Now, Thwaites found the letter and included it in the journals, but he does not make the connection that this is the name of the pillar. That was left to a fellow by the name of Bakeless, John Bakeless, in 1947. And he asked a simple question. He said, why is it that Lewis and Clark named every site after members of their family, members of the expedition, or politicians, except one site that they gave a Roman Greco name, and that's Pompey's Pillar? Why would he do that? And he starts looking through all the things, and if you look, remember the map, it was Pompey's Tower, and the creek across was Baptiste Creek. Well, Clark had called him Baptiste, my little boy Baptiste. So this area, they figured, was named after the boy, not after a Roman general, and we Americans like that a whole lot better, so that's what we stick with. They named it after the boy. And then another question that comes up quite often is, what's her name? Sacagawea, we say now. These are the ways it was written in the journals. And if you want to pronounce these, you need to say it with a Virginia accent, because these guys are Virginians, have a southern accent, and they're phonetically transcribing her name. And so you see it's done in many different ways, but today we call it Sacagawea, not Sacagawea, as I was growing up with, or Sakakawea, that's used in North Dakota. And then there's a very interesting picture. There was a fort built here called Fort Clark, right in this area, on the Missouri River. And it was a fur trade fort. It was opened during the 1830s. And that's where Karl Bodmer went with Prince Maximilian. And they spent the winter there. And this is an aqua tent that Karl Bodmer made when they came back from the trip in Germany. He put himself here, that's the artist. Here's the prince. This guy is Doppel, I forget his name right off the top of my head now, but he was the taxidermist. And I want to ask you, what is this fellow right here doing? What's he doing? You can see he's talking to the Indians and he's pointing to these guys. Could he be a translator?
Could be.
If he's a translator, the fellow who was the official U.S. government translator at Fort Clark at that time was Toussaint Charbonneau. This could be a portrait of Toussaint Charbonneau. We don't know that for sure, but it's very likely that this is a portrait that Karl Bodmer made of Toussaint Charbonneau. So, I find things like that in history very fascinating. To start putting stuff together like that. Thank you.
All right.
How much time did that take?